Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The history of the Americas is one of vast complexity, stretching back tens of thousands of years before European arrival. Indigenous civilizations flourished, exhibiting a rich tapestry of cultures, languages, and traditions. However, one often overlooked yet critical aspect of this history is the presence of dark-skinned Native Americans, indigenous peoples with complexions darker than the stereotypical depictions imposed by colonial narratives. The arrival of European colonizers in the late 15th century not only disrupted indigenous societies, but also set in motion a systematic erasure of certain indigenous groups, particularly those with darker skin tones. This erasure was not merely physical, through violence and displacement, but also historical, as colonial powers rewrote the past to fit their Eurocentric perspectives. From the accounts of early European explorers, we learn of indigenous communities with dark complexions, described in ways that challenge European notions of race. These accounts were often buried or distorted to fit the emerging racial hierarchies that placed European settlers at the top. Over time, through slavery, forced assimilation, and racial reclassification, the historical presence of dark-skinned Native Americans was marginalized, blending them into other categories such as African or mixed-race populations. The long-term effects of this historical revisionism are still felt today, as many descendants of these indigenous groups struggle to reclaim their heritage and identity. This article delves into the history of dark-skinned Native Americans, their interactions with European colonizers, and the ways in which their presence was erased from mainstream historical narratives. Through examining primary sources, oral traditions, and historical accounts, we uncover a suppressed history that challenges conventional understandings of race and identity in the Americas. Long before Europeans set foot on the shores of the Americas, diverse indigenous groups thrived across the continent. Some of these populations had naturally darker skin tones, a fact noted by early explorers and settlers. Contrary to the colonial myths that sought to homogenize Native American appearances, the indigenous peoples of the Americas exhibited a wide range of skin colors, influenced by genetic diversity and environmental factors. Archaeological and anthropological studies suggest that the first inhabitants of the Americas migrated from various regions, including Siberia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. The presence of dark-skinned peoples in pre-Columbian America is further supported by genetic evidence, oral traditions, and linguistic patterns linking certain Native American groups to ancient populations from Africa and the Pacific. Among the groups often cited in historical records are the early inhabitants of the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, and the southeastern United States. For instance, the Carib and Arawak peoples, who populated much of the Caribbean, were frequently described by early European explorers as having dark skin. The Olmecs, one of Mesoamerica's oldest civilizations, created colossal stone heads that bear distinct features reminiscent of African and Pacific Islander traits. While some scholars argue that these features are purely indigenous, others propose that they indicate a broader genetic and cultural exchange long before Columbus. In North America, several indigenous nations such as the Yamasee, Calusa, and Washita were noted for their dark complexion. Historical accounts describe them as being distinctly different from neighboring tribes, sometimes even mistaken for African peoples by early European colonists. Yet these were purely indigenous groups with long-standing histories in the Americas, whose erasure began with European colonization and intensified with the rise of racial classifications that sought to separate African, indigenous, and European peoples into rigid categories. With the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 and the subsequent wave of European conquests, indigenous societies faced an existential threat. The colonial powers of Spain, Portugal, France, and England sought to dominate the land, resources, and peoples of the Americas. As European settlements expanded, so did their racial ideologies, which sought to justify the subjugation of indigenous and African peoples. One of the primary tools of erasure was the practice of racial classification. Colonial governments implemented rigid racial categories to maintain control over populations and enforce labor systems such as the encomienda and later, chattel slavery. Indigenous peoples who did not fit into the stereotypical Red Indian image were often misclassified. Many dark-skinned Native Americans were labeled as black or mulatto, effectively stripping them of their indigenous identity in official records. The forced assimilation of indigenous peoples also played a crucial role in their erasure. The Spanish, for example, implemented a system of castas, which ranked individuals based on their racial mixture. Dark-skinned Native Americans who intermarried with Africans or Europeans were classified in a way that removed their indigenous heritage from historical memory. This systematic reclassification had devastating effects, as many indigenous communities found themselves legally defined as non-native, losing land rights and tribal affiliations in the process. Furthermore, the enslavement of both Native Americans and Africans created circumstances where indigenous individuals were forced into Black identity. Many indigenous groups were enslaved alongside Africans, and over time, their identities merged under the oppressive weight of colonial bondage. This blending further contributed to the loss of distinct indigenous histories, as colonial authorities increasingly viewed all dark-skinned peoples as African, regardless of their true origins. Despite centuries of erasure, the descendants of dark-skinned Native Americans continue to preserve their heritage. Many indigenous communities across North and South America have maintained oral histories that speak of their dark-skinned ancestors, countering the colonial narratives that sought to erase them. In recent years, scholars and activists have worked to reclaim the histories of these communities. The Washita Nation, for instance, has long asserted its indigenous roots, challenging historical narratives that attempt to classify them as African American. Similarly, certain Caribbean indigenous groups continue to assert their native identity despite centuries of colonial suppression. With advancements in genetic research, many indigenous individuals are discovering their ancestral roots, further reinforcing the historical presence of dark-skinned Native Americans. The resurgence of indigenous identity movements has also led to increased recognition of these communities in legal and academic spheres, challenging the long-standing colonial myths that sought to erase their existence. The history of dark-skinned Native Americans is one of resilience in the face of systematic erasure. While European colonization sought to rewrite the racial and cultural history of the Americas, the voices of indigenous peoples have endured, preserving the truth of their diverse heritage. By uncovering and amplifying these histories, we not only challenge the colonial narratives that have long dominated the discourse, but also honor the legacy of those who were nearly erased from history. As we move forward, it is crucial to continue researching, documenting, and sharing the stories of these forgotten peoples. Only through acknowledgement and education can we begin to rectify the historical injustices that sought to erase dark-skinned Native Americans from the annals of history.